Welcome to our deep dive today. Um, I think most people, when they think about ADHD, they see it as like the opposite of perfectionism.
Right.
But
Yeah.
you submitted this article from ADHD magazine, and it's called When Perfectionism Stems from ADHD, Challenging the Fallacy of Not Good Enough.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking, have you ever considered like how those two things might actually be connected?
That's such an interesting point. Most folks wouldn't immediately put those two concepts together. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We typically associate perfectionism with being meticulous, maybe even a little rigidity,
Right.
whereas ADHD often presents as well the opposite.
Totally. It seems so counterintuitive.
Right.
But that's why we're here to unpack this unexpected link
Right.
and explore the challenges it can create.
Yeah.
More importantly, we're going to look at practical strategies to help you break free from the perfectionism trap if that's something you're grappling with.
Absolutely. And I think before we dive into the ADHD connections specifically, it's crucial to make sure we're on the same page about what perfectionism actually is, because it's not just about being organized or liking things a certain way.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What's the difference between, say, liking a tidy desk
Yeah.
and true perfectionism?
It's about the intensity and the impact.
Okay,
Perfectionism is marked by this unhealthy obsession with flawlessness,
right.
where you're setting impossible standards for yourself and constantly feeling like you're not good enough.
Yeah.
It can really take a toll on your well-being.
Wow, that feeling of not good enough is something I think a lot of people can relate to, regardless of whether they have ADHD.
Absolutely.
And it makes total sense that this kind of thinking would be linked to mental health concerns.
It absolutely is. Perfectionism is a major driver of anxiety, depression, and a whole host of other mental health issues.
Wow.
So we're not just talking about striving for excellence here. We're talking about a mindset that can be really detrimental to your mental health.
So given that, how does ADHD fit into this picture? Because like you said, it seems counterintuitive.
It really does. But what researchers have found is that perfectionism can actually be a way of overcompensating for past ADHD-related mistakes
Hmm.
or for those feelings of inadequacy that often come with the territory.
Right.
It's like trying to make up for those times when ADHD might have caused you to slip up or fall short.
So it's almost like trying to create this perfect facade
Yeah.
to mask those struggles.
That's a great way to put it. And sometimes it can even manifest as a form of self-punishment.
Oh, wow.
Like you're holding yourself to these impossibly high standards as a way to atone for past mistakes.
That's heavy stuff, and I can see how the specific challenges of ADHD could feed into that.
Yeah.
For example, if you're constantly underestimating how long a task will take,
Right.
or struggling to access the resources you need to succeed, it makes sense that you might feel this intense pressure to be perfect to avoid those situations again.
Right.
The article mentions this too, with examples like incorrectly gauging task demands or
Mm.
missing cues about when to let go.
Exactly. Those are classic ADHD struggles, and they can really fuel perfectionistic tendencies. It's like a vicious cycle.
Okay, so we're starting to see this complex relationship between ADHD and perfectionism emerge.
Yeah.
But to make it even more interesting, the article breaks down perfectionism into three main types:
Right.
self-oriented, socially prescribed, and other-oriented.
That's right. Self-oriented is probably the most familiar.
Okay.
It's the internal pressure you put on yourself to be perfect in every way.
Okay.
You set unrealistic standards and are incredibly self-critical.
Yep.
It's that constant voice in your head telling you that you're not good enough no matter how hard you try.
Ouch. I think we've all experienced that inner critic at some point.
Absolutely.
What about socially prescribed perfectionism? That sounds especially relevant to the ADHD experience.
Absolutely. This one's all about feeling like you need to be perfect to win the approval of others.
Right.
It's that constant fear of judgment and rejection that can be really debilitating. And as you mentioned, social anxiety is already a common challenge for many people with ADHD.
Right.
So this type of perfectionism can be especially tough to navigate.
It's like you're always performing for an invisible audience.
Yeah.
Terrified of making a mistake that will reveal you as a fraud.
Right.
I can see how that would be exhausting. And what about other-oriented perfectionism?
This one is about projecting those unrealistic expectations outward onto other people.
Okay.
You might find yourself constantly criticizing others for not meeting your standards
Uh-huh.
or feeling frustrated when they don't perform perfectly.
Right.
It can really strain relationships and make it hard to connect with others authentically.
So instead of turning inward, it's all about holding everyone else to an impossible standard.
Precisely. And you can imagine how that can create all sorts of conflict and tension in your personal and professional life.
This is all painting a really clear picture of how perfectionism can manifest.
Yeah.
But I'm particularly curious about how this all ties back to anxiety. We've talked about the mental health impacts of perfectionism,
Right.
but I'd love to explore that connection more deeply, especially in the context of ADHD.
That's a great question. You see, anxiety often fuels this need for control and certainty.
Yeah.
When you're anxious, you're constantly scanning for potential threats
Right.
and trying to avoid anything that could trigger those feelings of discomfort or unease.
Yeah.
And perfectionistic tendencies become a way to try to manage that anxiety by creating a sense of order and predictability.
So it's like trying to create this perfect bubble where nothing can go wrong.
Exactly. But here's the catch. Those high standards that you set for yourself actually become a major source of anxiety.
Oh, no.
It's a classic self-fulfilling prophecy. You set yourself up for failure because those standards are impossible to meet, which then fuels your anxiety and makes you even more determined to achieve perfection. It's a vicious cycle.
It's like setting yourself up for constant disappointment, and I can see how this would be especially problematic for people with ADHD who already might be struggling with anxiety.
Yeah.
Isn't there even a statistic about this?
Yes. The article mentions that nearly 50% of adults with ADHD also experience anxiety disorders.
Wow, it's huge.
So this link between perfectionism and anxiety is incredibly relevant for this group.
Okay, so we've got this clear connection between perfectionism and anxiety,
Yeah.
and we know both are prevalent in people with ADHD.
Yes.
But what about the specific traits? Do perfectionism and ADHD actually share any common ground?
They do, and it's more than you might think. It really helps explain why this connection exists in the first place.
Okay.
One major overlap is the intense fear of failure.
Right.
But it goes deeper than that. It's not just about failing in general. It's about disappointing others.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that fear of letting people down can be especially strong for people with ADHD.
Yeah.
Maybe because we've experienced that disappointment from others so often ourselves.
That's a really insightful point, and it's important to remember that while a fear of failure can be motivating,
Right.
it can also be paralyzing if it's not managed effectively.
So it's about finding that balance between striving for excellence and being kind to yourself when you inevitably stumble.
Absolutely. And another shared trait is the tendency to set unrealistic or impossible standards. It's that all or nothing thinking,
Yeah.
where if it's not perfect, it's a complete failure.
Ugh, that one is so relatable. It's like there's no middle ground.
Right.
It's either a smashing success or a complete disaster.
Yeah.
And that kind of thinking can be really discouraging, especially when you're already struggling with motivation and self-doubt.
It can make it really hard to celebrate your accomplishments and appreciate your progress.
Yeah.
And right alongside that comes the constant comparison to others,
Oh, yeah.
which is a recipe for feeling inadequate,
Yeah.
especially in today's social media-driven world.
It's so easy to get caught up in comparing yourself to other people's carefully curated online personas,
Absolutely.
which are often far from reality.
Right.
And I think this can be especially true for people with ADHD who often compare themselves to neurotypical people and feel like they're falling short.
You're right. And when you combine that with the sensitivity to criticism that's often present in ADHD, which for some can even become rejection-sensitive dysphoria, an intense emotional reaction to perceived rejection,
Right.
it's no wonder people with ADHD can be prone to perfectionism.
That's a great point. And I think this brings us to a particularly relatable trait, being easily discouraged by setbacks.
Yeah.
I know for me, it can feel like all my positive momentum just vanishes in an instant when I encounter a challenge or make a mistake.
I hear you. It's like your brain fixates on that one imperfection and blows it way out of proportion, erasing all the progress you've made.
It's like our brains are wired to focus on the negative.
Yeah.
And this ties back to those perfectionistic tendencies, because if you're constantly striving for flawlessness
Yeah.
and then you hit a snag, it can feel like the whole endeavor is ruined.
Exactly. And speaking of focusing on the negative, two other shared traits worth mentioning are rejecting praise and depending on others for validation. These can be really tricky because on the surface, they might seem like positive qualities,
Right.
wanting to do a good job and seeking approval.
Yeah.
But when they're rooted in perfectionism, they can be incredibly detrimental.
So with rejecting praise, it's like you don't believe you actually deserve the recognition.
Yes.
You might brush it off as luck
Right.
or downplay your accomplishments even when you've worked incredibly hard to achieve them.
Yeah.
And depending on external validation, it's
Yeah.
like you need that outside approval
Yeah.
to feel good about yourself.
You nailed it. And this can become a dangerous cycle because you're constantly seeking approval from others
Yeah.
instead of finding it within yourself. It's like you're giving away your power to determine your own self-worth.
So it's about reclaiming that power and recognizing that your worth is inherent,
Yes.
regardless of what others think or say.
Exactly. And when you start to cultivate that inner sense of worth,
Right.
you're less likely to get caught up in those perfectionistic tendencies that are driven by external validation.
This is all so fascinating. Before we go any further, I want to talk about something that's often linked to both ADHD and perfectionism,
Okay.
procrastination.
Procrastination. It's the ultimate double-edged sword.
So how does procrastination fit into this whole picture? Is it the same for both ADHD and perfectionism?
That's what makes it so interesting. We both involve procrastination, but often for very different reasons.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these different flavors of procrastination.
Yeah. With perfectionism, you might find yourself procrastinating because you're waiting for the perfect conditions to start
All
something.
right.
This is all about avoiding mistakes and the shame that can come with them.
Yeah.
It's like you're so afraid of messing up that you'd rather not start at all than risk doing something imperfectly.
It's like that saying, perfect is the enemy of good. And I could definitely see how that fear of messing up can be paralyzing.
Yeah.
It's like you're stuck in this analysis paralysis,
Right.
waiting for everything to be just right before you take action.
You got it, but that just right moment might never come. Right. And meanwhile, the task is looming over you, creating even more anxiety.
So it's actually counterproductive in the long run.
Exactly. And then with ADHD, we often see what's called avoidance procrastination.
Okay.
This is when you put off tasks that seem too difficult or unpleasant because you're afraid of failing. And it's not necessarily about perfectionism. It's more about that feeling of overwhelm that can come when you're faced with a challenging task.
Oh, I definitely relate to that one. It's like the task feels so big and daunting
Yeah.
that you just shut down and avoid it altogether.
Right. And sometimes you might even convince yourself that you work better under pressure. So you wait until the last minute to start, even though that just adds to the stress and anxiety.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And speaking of stress and anxiety, isn't there another type of procrastination that's common in ADHD?
Yes, it's called productive procrastination, which can be a bit misleading.
Okay.
This is when you do easier, less important tasks to avoid the anxiety of tackling the harder, more important ones.
Oh, so it's like that classic scenario of cleaning your entire house to avoid studying for an exam. Been there, done that.
I think we all have. And on the surface, it can feel good to be productive, but ultimately it's just another way to avoid those tasks that are truly important.
And it usually just leads to more stress in the long run
Yeah.
because you're still left with that looming deadline and now even less time to complete the task.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So recognizing which type of procrastination you're dealing with can be really helpful in figuring out how to overcome it, because the strategies you use to combat perfectionism procrastination are going to be different from those you use to address avoidance or productive procrastination.
This is all incredibly insightful, and I'm sure a lot of people listening are having those aha moments right now.
Yeah.
But I think the question on everyone's mind is, how do we escape this perfectionism trap? What are some practical strategies we can actually use to manage these tendencies?
Great question. And the good news is the article outlines several practical strategies that you can start implementing today.
Yeah.
The first step, and this is crucial, is building awareness.
Okay.
You can't change what you don't recognize.
Okay. That makes sense. But how do you actually build that awareness? Is it just about paying more attention to your thoughts and behaviors?
It's a great starting point. The article recommends incorporating mindfulness into your daily routine.
Okay.
Pay close attention to those judgmental thoughts when they pop up. Notice how your body feels when you're starting to feel those perfectionistic tendencies creeping in, that tightness in your chest, that knot in your stomach.
Yeah.
The physical signs of stress and anxiety.
So it's about tuning into those internal signals, both mental and physical,
Right.
and recognizing the patterns.
Precisely. And once you start recognizing those patterns, the next step is to get curious about them.
Curious. What do you mean by that?
Instead of just beating yourself up for being a perfectionist, which a lot of us tend to do,
Yeah.
approach those tendencies with a sense of curiosity. Ask yourself questions like, when do I feel this overwhelming pressure to do something perfectly? Why am I so critical of myself when I make a mistake? What unrealistic standard am I trying to meet, and why is it so important to me?
I love that. So it's about understanding the root of those perfectionistic tendencies and what's driving them.
Exactly. And by exploring those questions with curiosity, you can start to uncover some of the underlying needs that might be fueling your perfectionism.
Yeah.
Things like needing to feel accepted, wanting to feel good enough, or craving praise and validation.
Those are all very human desires, and I can see how they could easily become distorted in a culture that often values perfection and achievement above all else.
Absolutely. And for people with ADHD, these needs might be even more pronounced due to past experiences of feeling misunderstood or inadequate.
It's like you're trying to overcompensate for those feelings by striving for perfection.
That's a great way to put it, and that's why it's so important to address those psychological precursors to perfectionism. It's not about trying to eliminate those needs entirely, but about finding healthier ways to meet them.
So it's about shifting from external validation to internal validation.
You got it. And this is where addressing things like imposter syndrome, fear of failure, and shame comes in.
Okay.
These are all common experiences for people with ADHD, and they can really feed into those perfectionistic tendencies.
Imposter syndrome especially is something I think a lot of people with ADHD struggle with. It's that feeling that you're a fraud and that you're going to be exposed at any moment.
It's incredibly common, and it makes sense when you think about it. If you spent your whole life feeling like you're not good enough or that you're constantly making mistakes, it's easy to internalize that belief and start to doubt your own abilities.
It's like you're constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop,
Yeah.
for someone to realize that you're not as competent as they think you are.
And that fear of being found out can be really paralyzing. It can keep you from taking risks, from putting yourself out there, from pursuing your goals.
So how do you combat that fear? How do you start to believe in yourself and your abilities even when you feel like an imposter?
Well, one powerful tool is positive self-talk. The article specifically suggests creating and repeating soothing, supportive phrases, things like, I'm trying my best and sometimes it doesn't work out. Or, we all make mistakes. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person.
I love that it's so simple, but I can see how those little reminders could be really helpful in shifting your mindset.
Yeah,
It's about actively challenging those negative thought patterns with more realistic and compassionate self-talk.
exactly. And you can even write those phrases down and post them somewhere. You'll see them regularly, like on your bathroom mirror or your computer screen.
Oh, that's a good idea.
It's like creating little reminders to be kind to yourself throughout the day.
Because when those negative thoughts start creeping in, it's so easy to get swept away by them. But having those positive affirmations top of mind can help you interrupt those patterns and choose a more supportive way of thinking about yourself.
Precisely. And remember, it takes practice.
Yeah.
You're not going to change those negative thought patterns overnight, but with consistent effort, you can start to cultivate a more compassionate and self-accepting inner voice.
Okay, so we've talked about building awareness through mindfulness,
Right?
getting curious about our perfectionistic tendencies,
Yeah.
addressing those underlying needs,
Yes.
and combating negative self-talk with positive affirmations.
Right.
Those are all great starting points.
Yeah.
What else can we do to escape the perfectionism trap?
The next strategy the article highlights is all about shifting your focus.
Interesting. What do we need to shift our focus to?
Instead of fixating on what's not working, what's wrong, or what you haven't accomplished, start paying attention to what's going well. Notice the things that are working no matter how small they might seem. Celebrate those little victories, those moments of progress, that feeling of accomplishment, even if it's just checking one small item off your to-do list.
I love that it's so easy to get caught up in that all or nothing thinking, where if we don't achieve perfection, we feel like a complete failure. But learning to savor those small wins can be such a powerful antidote to that kind of thinking.
Absolutely. It's about rewiring your brain to recognize and appreciate your progress, which can be incredibly motivating and help boost your self-confidence.
And I bet that can help break that cycle of constantly feeling like you're not good enough.
Yeah.
Because you're actively proving to yourself that you are capable and that you are making progress, even if it's not always perfect.
You're exactly right. And another crucial part of shifting your focus is to stop comparing yourself to others, because let's face it, comparison is the thief of joy, as they say.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's so easy to fall into the trap of comparing yourself to other people, especially with social media, constantly bombarding us with everyone else's highlight reels. It's easy to forget that those curated online personas are often far from reality.
Exactly. And the article makes a great point about how we're often comparing our insides to other people's outsides. We don't see the struggles, the insecurities, the behind-the-scenes messiness that everyone experiences. We're only seeing the polished, perfected version that they choose to present to the world.
It's like comparing your blooper reel to someone else's finished film. It's
Yeah.
just not a fair comparison.
It's really not. And it's important to remember that everyone is on their own journey and we're all at different stages. And for people with ADHD, I think this is especially crucial to keep in mind because it's so easy to compare ourselves to neurotypical people and feel like we're constantly falling short, like we're not doing enough or that we're somehow defective.
It's easy to internalize those societal expectations and feel like we're not measuring up.
You get it. But the truth is that there is no one right way to be. And we all have our own unique strengths and challenges. And the more we can focus on our own path and celebrate our own progress, the less power those comparisons will have over us.
So instead of looking sideways at what everyone else is doing, we should be looking inward and appreciating how far we've come on our own journey.
Precisely. And part of focusing on our own path means learning to accept our mistakes as part of the journey.
Okay, let's talk about that. How do we move from this mindset of needing to be perfect to a place of accepting our imperfections? Because that can be really tough, especially when you've been conditioned to believe that mistakes are a sign of weakness or failure.
It's definitely a shift in perspective. It starts with recognizing that mistakes are an inevitable part of life. We all make them. In fact, we need to make them in order to learn and grow.
That makes sense logically, but emotionally it can be really hard to embrace that idea, especially for perfectionists. Mistakes can feel like a personal attack, like proof that we're not good enough.
You're so right, and that's where self-compassion comes in. Instead of beating yourself up for making a mistake, try to treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer a friend who is going through the same thing.
I love that, but it's so much easier said than done right.
Oh, absolutely. It takes practice and a lot of intentionality, but I think it's one of the most important skills you can develop, not just for managing perfectionism, but for navigating life in general.
And I think it's especially crucial for people with ADHD who often have a harsh inner critic and struggle with self-doubt. We need to be our own best advocates and cheerleaders.
Yes, and remember, you have evidence of your resilience. Anxiety has a way of erasing our memories of success, but if you're struggling to be kind to yourself, try to actively recall those times when you've succeeded, when you've overcome challenges, when you've made yourself proud.
That's a great tip. It's like creating a mental highlight reel of your own accomplishments to combat those negative thoughts that try to tell you you're not good enough.
Exactly, and those positive memories can serve as powerful reminders of your ability to learn, grow, and achieve your goals even when you stumble along the way.
This is also helpful. I feel like we're really starting to build a toolkit for managing those perfectionistic tendencies. But there's one thing I'm still curious about. How do we deal with feedback? Because if you're a perfectionist, feedback can be a major trigger for anxiety and self-criticism. It could feel like a personal attack, even when it's intended to be helpful.
That's a really important point, and the article actually addresses this directly. The first thing to remember is that feedback is an inevitable part of life. Someone will always have something to say about you and your actions, whether it's positive or negative, and as much as we might like to avoid it, feedback can be a valuable tool for growth if we learn to approach it in the right way.
Okay, so we can't avoid feedback, but how do we handle it in a way that doesn't send us spiraling into self-doubt and anxiety?
Well, the key is to try to receive feedback with neutrality and grace. Consider the source and take some time to really think about the feedback before reacting to it.
So it's about taking a step back and responding thoughtfully instead of impulsively. Because I know for me, my knee-jerk reaction to feedback, especially if it's critical, is to get defensive and shut down.
I think a lot of us can relate to that, but by taking a moment to pause and reflect, you can interrupt that automatic reaction and choose a more constructive response. And the article suggests using reflective listening as a way to deflect that overly emotional response and create some space for processing the feedback.
Oh, interesting. How does that work? I've heard of reflective listening in the context of therapy, but I'm not sure how it applies to receiving feedback.
It's actually quite simple. After you receive feedback, you can simply repeat back what you heard to the person who gave it to you. Something like, what I heard you say is X. Did I get that right?
I love that it gives you a chance to process what you've heard, make sure you understand it correctly, and it also shows the other person that you're listening and taking their feedback seriously, even if you don't necessarily agree with it.
Exactly. And it helps prevent those impulsive emotional reactions that can lead to defensiveness and arguments. It's about staying calm and grounded, even if the feedback is difficult to hear.
And once you've had a chance to process the feedback, you can start to think about whether there's any truth to it.
Mm.
Is there something you can learn from this feedback? Is there something you can change to improve in the future?
That's the goal. It's about shifting from a place of defensiveness to a place of curiosity and a willingness to learn and grow. And remember, feedback is not about blame. It's about becoming a better version of yourself.
That's such a helpful reframe. It's taking something that can feel very personal and turning it into an opportunity for growth.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of it when we can let go of that need to be perfect and embrace feedback as a tool for learning. It can become a powerful catalyst for positive change.
This is all so incredibly valuable. I feel like we're really starting to unpack this complex relationship between perfectionism and ADHD, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling more empowered to tackle their own perfectionistic tendencies. But before we move on, I'd love to hear what other practical strategies you'd recommend for breaking free from perfectionism.
Well, one of the most crucial steps is setting realistic goals. Perfectionists often set impossible standards for themselves, which sets them up for failure and disappointment.
I can definitely relate to that. It's like you're always striving for this ideal that's just out of reach and it's exhausting.
It really is, and it's not sustainable in the long run. So instead of trying to achieve perfection, which is an illusion anyway, the key is to set goals that are actually attainable given your current resources and limitations.
So it's about being honest with yourself about what you can realistically achieve and honoring your limits.
Precisely. And it's about using your own compass to determine what's important to you rather than blindly following what others expect of you.
That's so important. It's about taking back control and defining success on your own terms. But how do you actually go about setting realistic goals? Because it's easy to say, but it can be hard to put it into practice.
Well, one tip is to start by considering what you can actually handle rather than what you think you should be able to handle. And if you're unsure about whether you can meet a request or take on a particular task, don't be afraid to set limits or ask for more time.
So it's about being assertive and advocating for your own needs.
Exactly. And another helpful strategy is to differentiate your goals. Not all goals are created equal, and some require more time, energy, and resources than others.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about how to differentiate goals.
Think about it like this. There are goals that we can complete most of the time with minimal support, those that we can tackle with some support, and those that are not in our wheelhouse yet. And it's important to be realistic about which category each goal falls into.
So it's about recognizing the level of difficulty and the resources required for each goal and not trying to do everything at once.
You nailed it. And the article suggests trying to have no more than two major goals at any given time. This helps prevent feeling overwhelmed and sets you up for success.
That's a great tip. It's about being strategic and intentional about what you choose to focus on. And it ties back to that idea of honoring your limits and being realistic about what you can actually accomplish.
Exactly. And speaking of being strategic, the last piece of the puzzle, and this is a big one for people with ADHD, is improving those executive function skills that are often tied to perfectionism.
Okay, this is really important. Executive function challenges are a core feature of ADHD, and they can definitely contribute to those perfectionistic tendencies. So what are some key areas to focus on?
The article highlights several key areas: time management, organization planning, and prioritization, emotional control, and metacognition.
Let's break those down. What are some specific strategies for improving each of those areas?
Absolutely. Starting with time management, one of the biggest challenges for people with ADHD is time blindness. It's that feeling of time slipping away from you, not being able to accurately estimate how long things will take, or constantly running late.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. It's like time has a different meaning in my world.
Exactly. So the key is to externalize time. And reminders, use calendars, alarms, timers, visual aids, whatever works for you to keep track of time and stay on schedule.
And routines can be really helpful for time management too, right? I found that having a consistent daily routine has been a game changer for me in terms of managing my time and staying on top of things.
Absolutely. Routines provide structure and predictability, which can be really helpful for people with ADHD who often struggle with impulsivity and disorganization.
So it's about creating a framework for your day that helps you stay focused and on track.
Hmm.
Okay, so what about organization? Any tips for tackling that one?
Well, one helpful strategy is to use lists, do a brain dump, get everything out of your head and onto paper or a digital list. Then you can start to prioritize those tasks and break them down into smaller, more manageable chunks.
That's a great idea. It's about getting that mental clutter out of your head and into a system where you can actually work with it. Because I know for me, when I have too many things swirling around in my head, it's easy to get overwhelmed and shut down.
Exactly. And remember, the goal is not to be perfectly organized. It's about finding a system that works for you and helps you function more effectively.
I love that it's about efficacy, not perfection.
You got it now for planning and prioritization. One tool the article mentions is the Eisenhower matrix. Have you ever heard of that?
I have. Isn't that the one where you categorize tasks based on urgency and importance?
That's the one. It's a really helpful way to visualize your tasks and prioritize what needs to be done first. And it can also help you identify those tasks that can be delegated or eliminated altogether.
So it's about being strategic and focusing your energy on the most important tasks.
Right. And when it comes to emotional control, the key is to find simple ways to support yourself when you're feeling overwhelmed or stressed. Because when our emotions are running high, it's much harder to think clearly and make rational decisions.
Okay, that makes sense. What are some examples of those simple supports?
Well, things like deep breathing exercises, mindfulness practices, positive affirmations, listening to calming music, or spending time in nature can all be really helpful in regulating your emotions.
Those are all great ideas. It's about having a toolbox of coping mechanisms that you can draw on when you need them.
Exactly. And it can be helpful to create a plan for how you'll handle those overwhelming emotions before you're actually in the midst of them that way. When those big feelings hit, you already have a strategy in place.
So it's like having a game plan for those moments when your emotions start to spiral.
Precisely. And the last executive function skill to focus on is metacognition.
Okay, that one sounds a bit complicated.
Yeah.
What exactly is metacognition? I've heard the term, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
It's basically thinking about your thinking. It's about becoming aware of your own thought patterns, your strengths and weaknesses, and how you learn best.
So it's about developing self-awareness and understanding how your brain works.
Exactly. And it can be as simple as asking yourself questions like, how am I doing? What's helped me in the past that I could apply to this situation? What are my go-to coping mechanisms when I'm feeling stressed or overwhelmed?
I love that it's about tapping into your own inner wisdom and using your past experiences to inform your present actions.
Exactly. And the more you practice metacognition, the better you'll become at recognizing those thought patterns and behaviors that are not serving you, and the more empowered you'll feel to make positive changes.
It's like becoming your own coach or therapist. You're developing the skills to observe your own mind and make conscious choices about how you want to think and act.
You're getting it. And by improving these executive function skills, you'll be better equipped to manage those perfectionistic tendencies and create a more balanced and fulfilling life. It's not about becoming a different person. It's about harnessing your strengths and developing strategies to work with your challenges.
This is all so incredibly valuable. I feel
Yeah.
like we've covered so much ground today, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling more empowered to tackle their own perfectionism.
I hope so. But before we wrap up, I want to make sure we touch on one last important point that the article highlights.
Okay, what's that?
It's the idea that overcoming perfectionism isn't about eliminating all our worries or pressure. It's about changing your reaction to those feelings.
That's such an important distinction because, let's face it, life is full of challenges and pressures. We can't avoid them entirely.
Exactly. And that's why the article emphasizes this idea of radical acceptance. It's about accepting yourself with all your strengths and weaknesses and embracing those imperfections as part of what makes you unique.
I love that it's about letting go of the need to be perfect and embracing the messy, imperfect beauty of being human.
Exactly. And it's about trusting in your ability to grow, learn, and adapt even when things don't go according to plan. Because that's where the real magic happens in those moments of imperfection and resilience.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about the connection between perfectionism and ADHD, and I'm feeling more hopeful about managing my own perfectionistic tendencies.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. Be patient with yourself, celebrate your progress, and don't be afraid to ask for help along the way.
Those are words to live by. So with that in mind, let's dive into the article's final thought-provoking question, which asks, what's one small step you can take today to challenge your perfectionistic tendencies and embrace a more self-compassionate approach?
That is a great question to end on. I know for me, when I think about making a change, I can get overwhelmed by the idea of doing all the things perfectly, which kind of defeats the purpose.
It's true, we can get so caught up in the big picture that we miss the power of those tiny, almost invisible shifts that happen day by day. So this question really invites us to think small. What's one thing, even a seemingly insignificant thing, that you could do differently today?
It doesn't have to be some grand gesture or a complete personality overhaul. Maybe it's just noticing when that inner critic starts to pipe up and gently challenging those negative thoughts. Like instead of saying, oh, I messed that up again, maybe you say, okay, I made a mistake. What can I learn from it?
That's a perfect example. It's about changing the script in those little moments. Or maybe your one step today is about setting a realistic goal that's focused on progress, not perfection. Like instead of aiming to clean your entire house today, maybe you focus on just decluttering one countertop.
Right. Or maybe it's something as simple as taking a few minutes to appreciate something you've accomplished, no matter how small it might seem. Like, hey, I actually got out of bed today and made it to work on time. That's a win.
Exactly.
It's about shifting your perspective and finding those moments of gratitude and self-appreciation throughout your day. It's about recognizing that you're doing the best you can with the resources you have, and that's enough.
You know, when we started this deep dive, I had this very narrow view of perfectionism. I saw it as being all about striving for excellence, always being the best, never making a mistake. But what we've uncovered is so much deeper and more nuanced than that.
It really is. Perfectionism isn't just about high standards. It's a mindset, a way
Yeah.
of relating to yourself and the world that can be incredibly damaging. As we've discussed and as we've explored, it's often intertwined with ADHD in ways that many people might not realize.
Absolutely. And one of the most important takeaways for me has been this idea of self-compassion. It's so easy to get caught up in that cycle of self-criticism and negative self-talk, especially when you're grappling with ADHD. But learning to treat yourself with kindness and understanding, even when you make mistakes, is absolutely essential for breaking free from that perfectionism trend.
Mhm.
I think that's a perfect way to sum up everything we've talked about today. It's about progress, not perfection.
Yeah.
It's about self-acceptance, not self-criticism. It's about embracing the journey with all its twists and turns and celebrating those small victories along the way.
Beautifully said. And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has been helpful and insightful.
Yeah.
You are not alone in this journey, and there are so many resources available to support you. So be kind to yourself and embrace your imperfections and keep striving for progress, not perfection.
We'll see you on our next deep dive. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep being awesome.